Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first talk in our latest lecture series, Lost Art Masterpieces. I am Charlotte Yung, a board member of the Asian Patrons of the Arts in the Vatican Museums, or APVM, and I shall be moderating this evening's presentation. There are 4 talks in this lecture series conducted every Tuesday from today, and all talks start at 8:30 p.m. Singapore and Hong Kong time. Speaking of Hong Kong, I want to give a shout out to 60 patrons and friends in Hong Kong who had gathered earlier this evening in a restaurant for dinner and have all stayed back in the restaurant to attend this lecture together. Our chairman, Mr. Ben Chung, is with them. Ben, please say a few words to launch this lecture series.
Thank you, Charlotte. So, good evening, Asian patrons and friends, and all who have dialed in from Europe and the US. A very good afternoon and a very good morning to all of you. Allow me first to bid you all a very warm welcome to this first lecture of our 4-part lecture series in Lost Art Masterpieces. And I'm really so glad that we have chosen a time that can allow us to have this global audience of over 200 or 300 people. Thank you all for making time to join us this evening, morning, or afternoon. Really, it has been a great start to this event. I would like, on behalf of the board, to thank all of you for your generosity of time, your support, and all for patrons for your contributions in helping the patrons organization advance the mission of the Vatican Museums in preserving and restoration of the priceless art treasures of the Vatican. And all of you must be gratified to know that you are following in a centuries-old history of many supporters of art that have helped build the Vatican Museums. Really, it is for art something of great beauty. I remember in a private audience with the Holy Father in 2019, he said that throughout history, art is only second to life in advancing faith and the Bible and our religion. It's art, just like faith follows the path of beauty. And in the words of St. Augustine, art is ever ancient, ever new. For us at the Patrons Organization, it is taking this ancient art to make it ever living to its original glory of newness, and to ensure that these are preserved and restored for future generations. And it is in this that I thank you sincerely for helping us with our mission. For those who are patrons, thank you, and friends of APAVM, for those who are not, I hope you can consider joining us. This evening, we have a great start, because lecture 1 is from a very good old friend of mine, Father Michael Collins, and I can assure you he will be very insightful and enthralling, a favorite of the Asian patrons. He will deliver, I am sure. So do remember to dial in also for the subsequent 3 Tuesdays, where we will have other spectacular speakers. So now I offer you back Charlotte Yung, who is our board member, to introduce Father Collins and today's topic, Caravaggio's Lost and Found Masterpieces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. The title of today's talk is Caravaggio's Lost and Found Masterpieces. Michelangelo Ciresi, better known as Caravaggio after his hometown, is one of the most famous artists in the world. Caravaggio was feted by wealthy patrons before being exiled from Rome for killing a man. Caravaggio pioneered the technique of light and shade in oil painting. This evening, Father Michael Collins will recount Father Caravaggio's life and tell us the fascinating story of the theft of his painting, The Nativity of St. Lawrence of Palermo. Another fascinating story is the discovery of another Caravaggio painting, The Taking of Christ, which was hanging forgotten over a fireplace in the Jesuit provincial house in Dublin. Father Michael will also enlighten us on how another work, Saint Jerome, was lost and happily found. Let me now introduce you to Father Michael Collins. He is a priest of the Archdiocese of Dublin and has taught history, art, and culture in a number of universities in Rome. A native of Ireland, Father Michael Collins studied art and archaeology at the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology in Rome. He is a best-selling author and has written and edited 15 award-winning books, which have been translated into 13 languages. His most recent book, Raphael's World, was just published in 2020 to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the death of Raphael. Father Michael has been featured on various international TV channels, including Fox News, CNN, NBCSN, Sky, and has appeared on 60 Minutes. Those of us who took part in the Asia chapter trip to Rome and Tuscany in June this year, which includes myself, had the pleasure of meeting Father Collins in person. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of European art history, and he regaled us with stories about the art we saw in Siena and Florence, stories that were often spiced with intrigue and scandal and told with a great sense of humor. You may find out more about Father Collins on his website, www.fathermichaelcollins.com. If you have any questions for Father about tonight's talk, please type them in the chat box and he will answer them at the end of the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Father Michael Collins.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And it's lovely to be able to join with you today, this evening. And yes, a very happy memory of that time that we spent in Italy. And I believe, in fact, we've more visits lined up in Ben's sleeve. So it's really something to look forward to. So I'm delighted to join you today on this lovely opportunity to look over, as Ben said, some ancient art and some modern art. But I've chosen as my subject Michelangelo, a different Michelangelo from the one that we're probably used to hearing about, Michelangelo, who's called by his hometown Caravaggio. And when Ben asked me a few months ago to come up with an idea for this new series, I just finished writing a book called Lost Masterpieces. It's a collection of about 90 works of art which have been lost, most of them completely lost. Few of them have been found, and it's just been published now. So I asked Linda, Maria Cristina, and Leonardo, friends of mine, to join in this lovely 4-part webinar. So now we have the opportunity of examining the first of our artists today, Caravaggio. So as far as we know, Michelangelo Merisi was born in the area of Caravaggio, a small village outside Milan. He was the firstborn to Fermo Merisi and his second wife, Lucia Aratori. Fermo was a stonemason, so we imagine that's probably where Caravaggio picked up his artistic interest. And his mother was connected with the Colonna family and the Sforza family because an aunt of hers had been a wet nurse, which was a practice common in those days when infants were given out to nurses in order to be looked after in their early days. So Caravaggio, small little village outside Milan. Milan was extremely important at that time. But in 1576, tragedy struck with the outbreak of the bubonic plague, which of course, as we remember, had entered Italy some time in the middle of the 14th century. And when we were in Siena, we saw the the effects of that terrible plague. The family retreated back to Caravaggio, hoping that they would avoid the plague, but within a year, the young Michelangelo had lost his father, his parental grandparents, and an uncle to the plague. Now, thanks to his mother's connection with Costanza Colonna, the family was saved from penury, and over the next few years, we imagine they simply survived. But the first record we have of Michelangelo, again, is in his 12th year, when he entered the workshop of Simone Petrozzano in Milan. Now, boys in those days usually entered into an area in order to practice the law or to become a priest or to do one of these subjects. This young man, obviously being talented, decided that he would follow in his father's footsteps, and he learned the technique of drawing and artistry. Now, these years in which the young Michelangelo was working corresponded with the Council of Trent, which was held between 1545 and 1563 in order to respond or to combat Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, and all the reformers who had heavily criticized the church's bad record on abuse. The Archbishop of Milan, Cardinal Charles Borromeo, nephew of Pius IV, who later on became a saint, enthusiastically encouraged the art which promoted all of this reform and improvement within the church. Now, we know little about Michelangelo's early life. As I say, he probably went to Venice for a short while, where he would have seen the work of Titian, of Tintoretto, of Giorgione. But we've no documentation of his lifestyle, but I think you'll be able to see it shortly when we see images of Caravaggio using a new palette, which was uncommon in that area. Now, sometime after his 21st birthday, Michelangelo Caravaggio went down to Rome. It was an important place, obviously, in antiquity, but it had, if you like, it had faded to some degree. But with the arrival of the year 1592, a new pope, Clement VIII, arrived, and artists flocked to the Eternal City because they knew that there was a new demand for great art. And as I say, at the Council of Trent, the fathers had said, we've got to produce artwork which will inspire piety in the people. There were new orders such as the Jesuits, the Theatines, the Oratorians, the Barnabites, amongst others. And significantly, pilgrims always deposited money everywhere they went. And so we would find significant demands of money and bequests and endowments, allowing the religious orders and indeed the popes to sponsor some of the great works. So Michelangelo was probably hoping to join the 2% of the Roman population, which made its livelihood from producing art. But in order to do that, he needed a patron, because you can't just arrive in a city and say you're going to do something. Rome was a vibrant city. Here we have a scene set between 1601, 1602 by a Netherlandish artist, Isaacson. And it just gives you a little idea of what Rome must have looked like and the way people were dressed in that time. There's a wonderful title to this painting. It's called The Double Marriage, because according to a legend, a young boy had a vision, he claimed, saying that in future men were allowed to marry more than one wife. And of course, you can see all the women arriving in the main square rather indignantly. And here's the little boy being quizzed about this new idea. And I presume he confessed that he was just up to some type of fun and games, but he obviously stirred up the people. Now, the young Caravaggio, you've got to remember, paint was expensive, so you had to take out a loan in order to buy your paints and your canvas. Oil painting was quite new. Caravaggio virtually never tried fresco. He has one or two small pieces surviving, but they're not of great significance in comparison to his wonderful canvases. So Caravaggio was then noticed by the Cavaliere d'Arpino, Giuseppe Cesare, who took him into his service and into his studio producing works of art. But Caravaggio was lucky enough to meet a man called Constantino Spata. We don't know much about Spata, and we don't know how the two of them came in contact, but we do know that Spata was one of those people, a middleman, who sold works of art by artists to wealthy patrons. And one of the early patrons that was taken by Caravaggio was the Cardinal Maria del Monte, who served as the Florentine ambassador to the court of Rome. So Caravaggio had been producing these wonderful scenes of young boys with bowls of fruit, etc. And he probably sold them to Spata. And then Spata, knowing that the cardinal would pass by every day on his way to this wonderful Palazzo Madama, which was owned largely by the Medici family, he knew that maybe he could entice him in. And indeed, one day the cardinal did come in. He looked at Caravaggio's works. He was fascinated with them and thought they were marvelous. And then he offered him the possibility of living in his household, providing food and lodging in exchange for more patrons and a small sum. Now, the cardinal entertained on a lavish scale, and the household records showed that he spent significant sums on musical entertainments and on feasting. It may have been during some of these musical entertainments that Caravaggio came across some new models, musicians whom he would paint, knowing that the cardinal would be pleased to display the canvases on a wall of his private apartments. So by now we're noticing that Caravaggio was expert in two things. One was facial expression, and the second was painting flowers and artwork. At this time, as I say, Caravaggio was benefiting from the surge of ecclesiastical commissions. We see Martin Luther on our left-hand side, and a session of the Council of Trent, which I mentioned took place between 1545 and 1563. And as a result of this, Caravaggio was able to get some important church commissions. Here we have a lovely scene of the death of St. Francis of Assisi. And again, now you can see Caravaggio extending, he's doing larger canvases, not just half scenes, but now here we have the whole body. So even though only a few years have elapsed, by contrast, we can see Caravaggio is moving in his style, and he's beginning to turn this into good effect, because his wonderful contrast of light and shade is even visible in something as simple as an arrangement of flowers. And again, just look at the wonderful liquid eyes, just barely touched by a paintbrush with some lead white paint, some oil paint. And remember, oil was a reasonably new technique, probably only 150 years old at this stage. And also look at the teeth, the way the saliva has moistened the lower lip and the teeth. Now, life wasn't all about religion and being serious, because you also had to have fun. And again, these were canvases which Caravaggio he painted in order to sell to his patrons, who would put these on the walls, and they would become conversation pieces. So when you had guests for dinner, at the end, you showed them your art collection. And this is a wonderful painting called The Card Sharks, again, dating from the end of the 16th, early into the 17th century. And we have a young man on our left-hand side, well-dressed, well-behaved, and he's playing a game of cards, but he's playing with sharks. So the chap in the middle with that wonderful hat with the feather facing off is looking behind him. And if you look at the hands, he's giving an indication that he has a 2 of something. So it could be ace, spades, diamonds, or clubs. And then the young boy with the waistcoat to our right-hand side, of course, has a card ready to replace. So these were amusing pieces. But Caravaggio was capable of so much, and here's a wonderful shield, a decorative shield, which he made for a procession, probably for the Duke Sforza in Milan. This is now in the Uffizi Gallery, and this would have been held by a soldier during a procession, not carried into war. And the scene is the wonderful scene where Perseus goes to see Medusa, and he wanders after Medusa. He finally catches her, and everybody else who tried to capture Medusa had been turned to stone because her hair turned into snakes and serpents. And according to the Greek legend, Perseus, when he arrived at Medusa, rather than look at Medusa, which was the way to be turned into stone, as he knew, he looked into the reflection of his shield. And there he was able to see the lady Medusa and then chop off her head. Now, the commission for which Caravaggio is probably best known by modern enthusiasts of his work are a set of 3 canvases on the life of St. Matthew in the Contarelli Chapel of San Luigi de' Francesi near Piazza Navona in Rome. Although this is a religious scene where Jesus walks in with Peter from our right-hand side and meets a group of tax collectors, this is a scene that Caravaggio would have had in any place in Rome, any tavern. And we see over on the far left, Matthew sitting at his counting table. He's a tax collector mentioned in the Gospels, but this is not something from the time of Christ in Palestine. This is very much real art. And so the people seeing this were seeing people that they could identify very easily with and recognize. This wonderful painting, really, it's a painting that very few people know. It's the wonderful Narcissus. Narcissus in Greek mythology apparently was a young man who was in love with his own reflection. He spent his time looking at looking glasses and in mirrors. And then on one occasion, he came across his reflection in a pond. And he was so encaptured by his own reflection and his own beauty that he bent down to kiss the face. And then he fell in and was drowned. And of course, that was a great morality tale about the vanity of beauty, which vanishes so quickly. Another wonderful scene is the beheading of Holofernes, again recounted in the Old Testament. And here we have Judith, accompanied by her maid, beheading the tyrant Holofernes. Now, the important thing about this is we can see now there's action. There's so much more action appearing in Caravaggio's work. And look at the wonderful contrast between the young Judith and the elderly maid. Caravaggio had 2 cardinals in his life. He had the Cardinal del Monte and he had another cardinal, the Cardinal Mattei. The Cardinal Mattei invited him to take place in his own palace because he was very impressed by Caravaggio's work and he wanted him to go and spend time with him, not only with him, but also his brothers. Cardinal Girolamo Mattei was a member of that wealthy aristocratic family, but his brothers also gave hospitality and commissions to the young Caravaggio. And these were to lead on to different commissions, because once you had a cardinal promoting your cause, you got noticed and went places. Now, by now, Caravaggio was regarded as a hugely important talent. His depiction of the crucifixion of St. Peter, which is now in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo at the Piazza del Popolo in Rome, was painted using models in his studio and lit by candles and lanterns. Now, this is a wonderful example of his trademark chiaroscuro, the contrast of light and shade. Now, note the artist's realism, showing the filthy feet of the man who is crucifying Peter. Caravaggio's violent temper exploded on the 28th of May in the year 1606, when he murdered a rival, Ranuccio Tommasoni, during a duel in the tennis courts at the residence of the French ambassador. Because he'd committed a crime, because he'd committed murder, he had to leave the Papal States, and so he fled for the city of Naples, knowing that the Papal police would have him executed if he'd been caught staying in Rome. Because Naples lay outside the jurisdiction of the Pope, Caravaggio was offered sanctuary at the residence of the Colonna family, which I mentioned a few moments ago, because through his mother, you recall, he had connections with his childhood nurse. Caravaggio moved some months later to Malta, probably with introductions to the civil authorities from the Colonna family. And once more, and probably through the good offices of this family, Caravaggio was able to meet some of the important people in the chivalric order of Malta, whose members played and had played a significant part in the liberation of the holy places from Muslim hands in Palestine during the Crusades. And once more, through the good offices of the Colonna family, Caravaggio was admitted to become a member of the Order of Malta. So once he was in that club, recognizing Caravaggio's talent, several prominent members of the small island's elite commissioned canvases, and among these were works for the Coke Cathedral, St. Jerome, and a beheading of St. John the Baptist. But things did not work out for Caravaggio because once more he was involved in a brawl. And if you look at police records both in Rome and in Sicily and Malta, you'll find his name comes up time and time again. Following his arrest during a brawl with a fellow knight on whom he had pulled a pistol, Caravaggio was put in jail, but from his seaside prison, he was able to escape and make his way to Syracuse in Sicily. While the order could not reach him there because that was beyond their remit, Caravaggio was dismissed from the order, and a message was published that indicated that should he ever be caught, he could be happily executed by a member of the Order of Malta. So Caravaggio was a man who continuously reinvented his time, and during the period of little over a year in Sicily, he produced at least 4 canvases that we know of for religious patrons. But he decided to move back to Naples in 1609, where he received 3 more important commissions. And once more, he was involved in a brawl, and his attackers left him badly defaced. Now, suspicions always hovered around members of the Order of Malta because it's possible that some of them may have wanted to carry out a revenge killing, but they had not actually managed to kill him. So a papal pardon was requested by Cardinal Fernando Gonzaga, who at that time was protector of the Order of Malta. He's depicted on the right-hand side after he had renounced being a cardinal in order to marry and continue the ducal line of the Gonzagas in Mantua. And on our left-hand side, we see Pope Paul V, a very important family, Borghese family in Rome at that time. So Caravaggio had just painted the new portrait of the new Pope a few years earlier. So it may be that that was why the Pope was willing to forgive him. In any event, Caravaggio was given permission to enter the Papal States, but curiously, he didn't go directly to Rome. He sailed for Tuscany before entering the Papal States. And while at the seaside town of Portercole on the 18th or the 19th of July, 1610, Caravaggio died. And the cause of his death is as yet unknown. So that's a little overview of the life of Caravaggio. So let's have a little look at some of the works which disappeared and have reappeared. I mentioned Malta being a very important place for Caravaggio. Malta is a small island which I understand the patrons are going to visit next year on a visit possibly in April or May. And that will bring the patrons face to face with some of these wonderful works by Caravaggio. But in this case, we know that one of the wonderful works of Caravaggio nearly disappeared fully from view, and we would not be able to have it if it had not been found by a Dominican friar. So I want to tell you a little bit about the story of this. On the 29th of December, shortly a few days after Christmas in 1984, 3 men entered a chapel in the Coke Cathedral of St. John and slit a canvas of St. Jerome from its ornate frame. And then rolling up the canvas, the three men, if there were three, two or three, carried the canvas from the church and disappeared. Now, there was no security cameras in those days, as you know, and witnesses were only able to recall that there were two or three people in the cathedral at that time. It appeared as if they were saying their prayers, but there was also some workmen, and they thought that these thieves were workmen. So for about 2 years, the Maltese police searched in vain for the work, but they finally resigned themselves to the likelihood that it was no longer on the island and had completely disappeared. And yet, after 2 years, on the 24th of November 1986, a Dominican friar received an envelope from an anonymous source saying that the work which had been stolen from the cathedral was still on the island of Malta. And if the authorities at the cathedral wanted to have St. Jerome writing a letter once more, they would have to pay a ransom of 500,000 Maltese lira. I'm not sure how much that was in those days, but I remember from living in Italy, being a millionaire, in fact, almost being a billionaire, because everybody seemed to have billions of lira in their pockets, which corresponded with a few dollars in today's worth. Now, Fra Marius, the Dominican friar, gained the confidence of the people who claimed that they had the canvas. He had become the director of the museum in Valletta at the time, and they thought he'd be a good person to contact. He was, in actual fact, a nephew of the former Prime Minister, Sir Paul Boffa. So this appeared to be a good move. But the good Dominican friar was not as honest as the thieves thought he would be, because he turned them over to the police, and he contacted a retired friend of his, of a member of the Carabinieri, the police force, who was able to tap and trace the phone calls and work out where they had come from. And then on the 4th of August, 1987, 3 representatives of the gang agreed to visit Fra Marius in his office at the Museum of Valletta. He was then expected to hand over a significant sum of money, at least part of the ransom to start with. But the thieves lost their nerve because they'd seen some police activity in the area, and they were suspicious that maybe the Dominican wasn't as honest as they thought he was. So there was illegal tapping going on, and as a result, they weren't able to carry on. The police finally raided the place where the work had been kept. Fra Marius is now regarded as almost a hero, because he was the one who led to the finding of this wonderful work of art, which had disappeared for 2 years and almost disappeared for good. And now it's hung in the cathedral once more, but it's no longer at eye level. It's been hanged over a door, as you can see, quite high, so it's quite difficult to arrange. But I think we should be grateful for Marius for his achievement in tracing down the thieves and outwitting them. Doesn't often happen. Now, we mentioned Malta, and now we travel to Sicily, where I mentioned that Caravaggio had lived for a couple of years towards the end of his life. On a stormy night on the 17th of October in 1969, some thieves broke into the small oratory of San Lorenzo, which is a stone's throw away from the Cathedral of Palermo. The church was administered by Franciscans at the time, but the friars had never thought of employing security. I mentioned to you before, there were no security cameras really in those days, and they'd certainly never thought of installing an alarm. But just some weeks beforehand, Italian television had broadcast a program which featured some of the artwork of Caravaggio, and it was perhaps this which gave the thieves the idea of stealing a Caravaggio work of art which was on their own island. The painting, measuring 3 meters by 2, hung over the high altar in the little oratory of San Lorenzo, which is decorated with the most wonderful stucco, which we'll see in a couple of moments. So as you can see, you come in a very unobtrusive, unprepossessing gateway to go into the oratory, which has a little fountain at the center. But there's no way that you would think, just walking past the door, that just tucked away would be a Caravaggio. In fact, I visited Palermo about 3 years ago, and I was fascinated by the way that was just hidden away, and so many of these wonderful works of art, which as patrons were determined to preserve and to pass on to the next generation, are tucked away. In fact, I think UNESCO's nominated Italy as the place where the greatest amount of art is concentrated in the world. So entering in, you see what I mean, entering into this wonderful building, the Oratory of San Lorenzo, you might be surprised to see a painting hanging over the high altar. And yet this is only a copy, which I'm going to explain in a few moments, because according to the FBI, this is one of the top 10 most wanted works in the world. And all around the walls, you can see these wonderful sculptures, plaster sculptures by the artist Zerpotta, Giacomo Zerpotta. And we come up towards the altar. And again, it looks as if that is the painting, but in actual fact, it is a copy, which I'll explain about in a moment. Now, for decades, the police, more than 50 years, the police have been looking for this and trying to work out what happened. It's a wonderful work of art. We cannot say that it's Caravaggio's greatest work of art because he clearly painted this in a hurry. It was done for a commission. He didn't have a studio. And just remember, of course, it wasn't until the 19th century that artists were able to paint in the open air. And that was with the invention of the little aluminium paint tubes, or prior to that, the pig's bladder, in which oils were mixed and could be taken away. And that's why we find, for example, some of those wonderful scenes by the Impressionists from the 19th century have sand, the seascapes have sand in the oil because the sand was blowing onto the oil, and unwittingly the painter was painting the sand into the work itself, some of which has left us with wonderful glistening works of art. So what happened? The truth is that nobody knows what happened to this work of art by Caravaggio because it still has not been uncovered. Eventually in 2015, an art reproduction firm, Factum Arte, made a digital photograph and installed the copy in the oratory of San Lorenzo, where we see it today. And they were able to cover it with a synthetic varnish, which is similar to the type of varnish that Caravaggio would have used in his day. So hope of finding the painting is fading. One story claims that the mafia boss, who is supposed to have ordered the work's theft in the hope of selling it, realized that it now had become a liability, and if that he was visited by the police, he'd have something dangerous in his possession. So therefore, he fed it to pigs. So therefore, it would be impossible to find. But of course, I think most of those stories are really just parts of an over-vivid imagination. The reason why the painting is so faded and doesn't have anything of the vibrancy of Caravaggio is that we only have paintings which were taken prior to 1969 when the work was stolen. So therefore, photography in those days was very different from the digital photography which we have today. But nevertheless, Factum Arte, who are doing lots of reproductions, and they're a wonderful firm. I recommend their work highly. And in fact, if you have a Rembrandt at home and you're thinking of putting it in the vault and want a copy, well, then maybe you'd contact them. But this gives you a very, very close idea, an approximation of what the work looked like in its day. Now we move back to my own native city, Dublin. And we're looking at a final work by Caravaggio, and I'm happy to say that this one didn't disappear entirely. We have been able to trace it, and I want to tell you the fascinating story of what happened. The arrest of Christ is not a very commonly depicted item in the life of Christ's work by artists. But this woodcut by Albrecht Dürer, who's just a little bit before Caravaggio, shows the arrest of Christ. And it is possible that Caravaggio would have seen Dürer's woodcut, which had been produced in volume in the period of Caravaggio. These were sold quite cheaply, and Caravaggio may have got the idea for his great work, the taking or the arrest of Christ. It's a wonderful work. What do we know about this work itself? Well, we know that, first of all, it is definitely an oil painting. In 1602, Michelangelo Merisi di Caravaggio painted the taking of Christ for one of the family, the Mattei family that I mentioned earlier, Ciriaco Mattei. The painting remained in the Mattei family in Rome, in the Palazzo, and was inherited by various members of the family from one generation over the next 200 years. However, by the second half of the 18th century, Caravaggio was really no longer a popular name. People didn't recognize him. His style had completely dropped out of fashion. And in the 18th century, they took the painting down off the wall. And they also probably misattributed the work of art. And they said it was by a man called Gerrit von Honthurst, who was born in 1592 at the same time, the same year in which Caravaggio arrived in Rome. He died in 1653. But he was fascinated by Caravaggio's works. And many of Honthurst's works use this wonderful work, use this wonderful shade and light and shade, which has become so important. So it was called the work of Gerardo delle Notti, the night scenes painter Gerald, and it was a misattribution. So therefore, they'd made a mistake. And in 1802, the Duke Giuseppe Mattei decided that he would sell some of the works of art and try and raise some capital. So there was a Scottish man at the time visiting Rome. His name was William Hamilton Nesbitt, and he bought the painting along with a few other pieces. But this painting, he believed, like everybody else, that it was a work by Gerald of the night scenes. And so it was brought to Scotland, and it was in the family collection for 119 years, similar to the way that it had been in the Mattei collection before it had been sold. But it finally went to auction in Dowell's auction house in 1921, and then was sold again a year later in 1922. And it was in 1922 that the lady seated on the chair on the far left of our picture bought this. Her name was Mary Lee Wilson, and she had decided to buy this because she was in Scotland, firstly on a holiday, but also on the trail of an Irish stained glass artist called Harry Clark. And she wanted him to make a stained glass window in memory of her husband, who'd been shot during civil unrest at the turn of the 20th century. So while she was there, she went into the auction, she bid for it. We don't know how much she paid, but she brought it home and she had it reframed, and she paid £20 for it to be reframed. So how much in today's terms, it would be difficult to tell, especially with the stock market the way it is today. I don't think anybody will be able to make a guess. After a certain while, she decided that she didn't want the painting or like the painting. And in particular, she had become a successful doctor at the time, one of the first female doctors to qualify in Ireland at the time. And she gave the painting to the Jesuit fathers who lived on Leeson Street at the centre of Dublin at St. Stephen's Green. So she donated the painting. The Jesuit fathers didn't really know what to do with it. They knew it was a religious painting, and they put it in their refectory where they had their meals in common. And there it remained until 1990. And in August of 1990, Father Noel Barber, who was superior of the house at the time, contacted the National Gallery because he wanted the National Gallery to have a look at some of the works of art that they had in the house. Because, as you know, very often people donate works of art of a religious theme to religious houses, and they don't know what to do with them. So they put them on the walls. But in this case, they thought, well, we better have them valued and have them looked at by the gallery. So a man called Sergio Benedetti came up to the house. He looked at this work and he said, it's very unusual. He came from the National Gallery of Ireland. He said, it's very unusual. He said, the original of that is actually in Odessa, in today's Ukraine. So he said, this is obviously a copy by Gerald of the Night, which is interesting. That happened in those days, but it's probably worth quite a lot of money. And Father Barber probably said, as any good priest would, how much? And the restorer said, well, I can't give you a figure on that, but certainly it should not remain here on the wall. It's too dangerous because it couldn't be insured. And if thieves were to break in, that would be the end of it. So they decided to donate it to the gallery. And here we have Sergio Benedetti looking at another work. And I met Benedetti a few years ago and he told me this tale. And the Jesuits then were really arm twisted into giving the work of art to the National Gallery on permanent loan, because it is true, they couldn't hold on to it, they couldn't keep it. It was too dangerous to keep in the house. Once word would get out, it was going to be stolen sooner or later. So now the public are able to go and visit this wonderful work, the Caravaggio, which has been identified. Now, I want to conclude by just asking, how do you recognize a stolen work of art? There are so many different ways, and I think we might be talking about this in our question and answer. But one of the things is, if you want to identify a work of art which is an original piece, first of all, you probably will look at the varnish, and if the varnish is a varnish which would correspond to a recipe of the era in which you're examining, well, that's one clue. Another step is look at the paints, because some paints are synthetic paints which are modern and have only been invented in the last 50 or 100 years. So if you find a paint, for example, titanium white, that's a sure clue that it's a fake, because in the old days, artists used lead white, which of course is poisonous, and that's why so many of them died young. And then the final thing, and this is what clinched it for Benedetti, and he got two Italian girls to help him on the identification. This is the copy in Ukraine, in Odessa. And the reason we know it's a copy is because it has no what is called pentimenti, or second thoughts, because the original painting by Caravaggio was painted without a drawing. He painted from life straight onto the canvas. Copies, of course, would not need to show those underpaintings, those second thoughts. So therefore, when you see an original, it will have underneath places where the artist changed the position of the ear, the eye, the nose, the mouth, having second thoughts, trying to get a better expression or changing expression. The copies never have that. So there you are. If you go home and you have something on your walls you want to take down, by all means do, and let us know how rich you are. Thank you so much for your attention, and I think we're going to go back now to questions and answers.
Thank you, Father Collins, for your very interesting talk. If you have any questions for Father Collins, please type them in the chat box. We have a few questions typed out earlier. The first one I will answer. The first one is from Suzanne Wentz. Will the video be available after the session? Yes, Suzanne, the videos will be available on YouTube. I think the tech people will take a day or two to put it up. And the second question here, this is asked by Mr. William Chang. Caravaggio's art was often controversial and questionable. Why was this so? And when was he vindicated? And when did he eventually secure acclaim and recognition?
Could you say that once more? I'm afraid I
Okay.
didn't catch that.
He's
How he was questionable.
okay, he said he starts with a statement. Caravaggio's art was often controversial and questionable. Why
Yes.
was this so? And when was he vindicated and eventually when did he eventually secure acclaim and recognition?
Yes, that's a great question. Wonderful question. I would say the reason that Caravaggio was controversial is, as I showed you with the feet of Saint Peter and the man who's crucifying him. I know that that was very controversial because people were used to saints with halos, beautifully dressed and washed and clean. But Caravaggio was showing these people as real life. So he certainly fell out, as I mentioned, he fell out of fashion within less than 100 years of his death. And then I would say he probably only came back in the last 100 years or so. Now, the last painting you've asked, how much is he worth, or how did he come back into fashion? That's a very difficult one. It would be really what people are willing to pay and why is he recognized as one of the great artists. I think it's really his technique is what people appreciate today.
Okay, then the next question is asked by our chairman, Mr. Ben Chang. How long would it have taken Caravaggio to paint an artwork, and did he even paint it himself? How much would a Caravaggio be worth today? Was there any piece sold recently?
Well, we do know that he painted extremely quickly. He was very rapid, and I would say that he would certainly do a canvas in probably about 6 months to 12 months. But it's a very good question, very good point, because remember, the artist usually only started off the work and then handed over to the studio, because there were people mixing paints, grinding paints, getting the brushes ready, cleaning the brushes, stretching the canvas, etc. So all of these jobs, if you like, all of these things were done by a team. So a production of a Caravaggio was Team Caravaggio, if you like. How much was something worth today? Well, we do know that a few months ago, there was a Roman villa which was on sale for, I think it was Boncompagni had the sale of it. And the Italian government was looking for 471 million for that work, and particularly because it was a fresco by Caravaggio, but it didn't sell in actual fact.
Okay, thank you, Father. The next question. Why is Caravaggio's painting, The Calling of St. Matthew, considered his best work? This is asked by Mr. Bruce Hemmingson.
Well, I suppose in a sense, it's a little bit like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I'm not sure that we could say it's his best work, but it's hugely technically competent. The composition is excellent. There's great movement within it. And you might have noticed the hand of Jesus walking in to call St. Matthew. And he has his hand in the same way as God the Father creating Adam on the roof of the Sistine Chapel.
Bruce has another question. Do we know what the last documented painting of Caravaggio is, and where is it?
I would say we probably do, but I would also say that I don't know.
Okay, Linda Liu has a question. First, she thanks you, Father, for a wonderful, informative talk on Caravaggio, and she wants to know if you could say a little more about the technique of lighting a painting, best known and used by Caravaggio, called chiaroscuro. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly.
Chiaroscuro, yes.
Yes.
Well, I can explain a little bit more about that, because in order to give depth to the painting, in order to give perspective, one of the tricks that an artist will use light and shade. And even in photography, we see that today. If you have a painting of a landscape, the hills in the far distance are in fact blue, and the further away they get, the bluer they get. And this is partly from aerial, from perspective, but it's also because of distance, and things which recede are lighter in color from our view. So therefore, remember, Caravaggio was working in a studio. He's working in a smallish room in the palace, at the palazzo of the cardinal or of his patron, and therefore he used lanterns and candles, and that's why he was able to open the side of a lantern and put it on the face, let's say, of the models in order to illuminate the face, and therefore the rest of the room he could just paint in very dark colors.
For friends and patrons in Hong Kong, would any of you like to ask a question, please? Please stand up and ask Father.
We're all very shy over here. No.
What about yourself, Lillian? You have something to ask?
No, Ben has already asked all the questions just now. On behalf of Hong Kong.
Let me see. I think there's one more. Father, somebody made a comment. The last Caravaggio sold in 2019, Lost Judith and Holofernes, was for 170 million.
Ah, very good. Well, now we have it.
That's Maria Pereira. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's great.
Vivian Lai wants to know, do you know if there are any artists in recent times who paint in the Caravaggio style?
Well, I'm not sure. No, I'm not sure that I could identify that. However, what I can say is I know that several Oriental Asian artists, artists from the East, and including China, have done wonderful reproductions. And I mentioned a few moments ago the art company which is doing reproductions of artwork, which are photographic reproductions and then producing them on canvas paper, so they almost look like the original. But some of these artists are extraordinary, and they can do by literally with their own hands and their own brushes, they're able to produce these wonderful works of art which are almost indistinguishable from the originals.
Here's an interesting question asked by Lina Lau. Do you think there is a difference in his artistry and skills when he paints for the laity and for the religious church?
Well, it's not so much his skill or his artistry, it's simply the subject matter is different. One are amusements, as I say, the card sharks, the boy with the flowers, the boy with the fruit, etc. What we want to look at is who the patron is. So who's paying the money? What do they want? If they want something to amuse them on the wall, that's what they get. If they want to have something which is to inspire people in a church, it's going to be a very different setting. So that's actually part of the skill of these artists. Leonardo was able to do it. Raphael was able to do it. Michelangelo, all the great names were able to tune themselves into the request of the artist.
I think there are no more questions. One more question from Hong Kong.
I have a question about the artist, his childhood, because it seems like he had quite a tumultuous upbringing, getting into fights and whatnot. So can you please talk about his childhood and how that shaped his work on the canvas in a negative or positive way?
I think that's very true, and that's why I highlighted a little bit about the experience which he had. By the age of 6, he'd lost most of the male members of his family, which really means that he was very much, if you like, he was very much a victim of the violence of Milan at that time. And I wonder, does that show, I mean, even, for example, in the beheading of Judith and Holofernes, does that show in that violence? This was something that he had done himself. And as we know, he'd murdered somebody, so he's familiar with brawls and death.
Looks like there are no more questions. So I would like to now thank Father Collins for speaking to us this evening. Thank you,
Thank you
Father.
very much. Such a great pleasure, and I hope everybody enjoys Linda and Maria Cristina and Leonardo in the next few weeks.
Yes, we will. Thank you, Father. So the next talk, next Tuesday, is entitled The Tale of the Getty Venus and the Rusborough Estate. The Rusborough Estate is Ireland's most famous and magnificent Georgian house in the Wicklow Mountains. It contains hidden treasures of fine and decorative arts from the classical period, the Renaissance, and 17th century Dutch art. The collection includes Roman marble sculptures of gods of the pantheon like Apollo, Achilles, and Venus. Their disappearance in the early 20th century and the recent discovery of the lost Venus in the Getty Villa Museum in California is a happy tale and will be presented by Dr. Linda Malvin. Dr. Linda Malvin is University College Dublin Professor of Architectural History. She is a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, London, for her outstanding commitment to recording the past. She has a specialist background and interest in classical antiquity and medieval art, and is a qualified historic building consultant. Her latest book, published in January this year, is entitled The Life and Works of Robert Wood, Classicist and Traveller, 1717 to 1771, which she co-authored with Rachel Finnegan. If you enjoyed this talk, please consider joining APAVM as a patron or friend of APAVM. You may visit our website for more information. Thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to your participation again next Tuesday, 4th of October at 8:30 p.m. Singapore time. Good night.